The young man from the Crow Wing County Miner had come expecting a quote. 2 sentences, maybe 3, something he could fit beneath a photograph of the old Voss property before they broke ground on the new feed warehouse. He had his pencil out and his notebook open on his knee, and he was already composing the headline in his head when Elias Brandt set down his hammer, looked at him for a moment, and said the thing that changed the shape of the afternoon. There are 3 people in this story whose names ought to be in the county record and aren't. I'll get to that. Then he sat down on the church step he had been repairing, folded his hands, and began. My name is Elias Brandt. I have been a carpenter in this county for 41 years, and before that I was a carpenter in Wisconsin for 9, and before that I was a boy in my father's workshop in Sheboygan, learning the difference between wood that would hold and wood that only looked like it would hold. I know what a well-built structure feels like from the inside. I know what it sounds like when cold finds a gap in a wall. I have built things I am proud of and things I would do differently, and I have spent a fair portion of my working life repairing the decisions of men who were in too great a hurry to think carefully. I tell you this so you understand that when I say Marta Voss built the most practical thing I have ever seen constructed in this county, I am not speaking as a man who is easily impressed. I am speaking as a man who built part of it with his own hands without understanding what he was building, and who has spent 23 years thinking about what that says about him. She paid me in fresh milk, 3 quarts a week, for as long as the work lasted. My wife was ill that summer, and the doctor had said milk, and Marta Voss had 2 healthy cows, and a need for a carpenter willing to work on unusual terms. It seemed a fair arrangement at the time. It seemed like considerably more than fair after January. I should start where everything in that township started, which was with the land itself. Crow Wing County in 1888 was not a gentle place to make a claim. The timber companies had been through the northern sections and left their particular kind of silence behind them, cut-over land, slash piles, second-growth scrub that provided neither the windbreak of old forest nor the clear horizons of true prairie. What remained was a middle landscape that gave you the worst of both, open enough that winter wind built speed across it, varied enough in its terrain that you could never quite predict from which direction the cold would arrive. The farms sat at distances from one another that required intention to bridge. A visit to a neighbor meant preparation. A crisis at midnight meant waiting for dawn. The township was a community in the way that scattered stars form a constellation. The pattern was real. But the distances between points were not small, and light traveled slowly. Heinrich Voss had chosen his 40 acres for the creek that ran along the eastern edge and for the slight rise of ground to the north, which he believed would deflect the worst of winter's approach. He was a practical man, a blacksmith by training, and he had spent 3 years improving the cabin and breaking sod and learning the specific personality of this piece of land. He died on the 12th of April, 1888, of pneumonia that came on in the wet cold of early spring and did not leave. The ground was still partially frozen when they buried him. The service was brief, not from lack of feeling, but from practical necessity, and Marta Voss stood at the graveside with her hands folded into her apron and her eyes on the turned earth and did not cry in front of anyone. Whether she cried afterward is not something I know. It is not something I asked. The township expected 3 things of a widow in those years. She could return to family, if she had family to return to. Marta had a brother in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a man she corresponded with twice a year on practical matters. She could sell the claim and move into town, where a woman alone was at least within calling distance of other people. Or she could remain on the land but accept the informal governance of the community, the congregation's help with the heavy work, the Reverend Peck's quiet oversight of her decisions, the general arrangement by which a woman without a man was folded back into the collective rather than left to operate as an independent unit. Marta Voss did none of these things. She spent the first week after Heinrich's burial going through his ledger books. I know this because Agnes Lindqvist told me later, and Agnes had it from the girl who delivered eggs to the Voss farm that month. The girl said that every time she came to the door, Marta was at the table with the ledger open and a pencil in her hand, and the candle had been burned well down. She was not weeping. She was not staring at nothing. She was reading columns of figures and writing in the margins. What she was calculating, I did not understand until she explained it to me in June. But the short version is this. Heinrich had been the one to cut and split and stack the firewood through the summer and early autumn. And Heinrich was gone. And the ground that needed breaking, and the fences that needed setting, and the 2 cows that needed tending were not going to stop needing attention because the man who had done those things was in the ground. Marta Voss was 41 years old, strong, and not inclined toward self-pity. She had 7 months before winter arrived. She opened the ledger and she began to count. What the count told her was not comfortable. A Minnesota winter in that county required, on average, 4 to 5 cords of split hardwood for a cabin of her size. A man working through the summer could put that up. A woman managing a farm alone, through a summer that had already started short one person, could put up perhaps 3 cords if she was fortunate and nothing else went wrong. She was starting from behind, and the winter did not negotiate. She had 2 choices as she saw it. She could burn what she had and hope the winter was mild, which was not a plan so much as a wish, or she could find a way to make the cabin need less wood to stay warm. Reverend Peck came by on the 4th day after the burial to offer the congregation's assistance and to gently inquire about her intentions. He was not an unkind man. He had genuine concern for the widow's welfare and genuine belief that the community was better organized when its members relied on one another through difficulty. He sat at the table where the ledger was open, and he said carefully that there was no shame in accepting help, that Heinrich would have wanted her to be safe, that the township stood ready to assist in whatever way she needed. Marta offered him coffee, listened to everything he said, thanked him, and showed him to the door. Peck told people afterward that she seemed to be managing well. He had mistaken efficiency for recovery. Most people did that spring. I was hired in the 2nd week of June. The terms were communicated through the feed store, where Marta had left word that she needed a carpenter who could work for payment in kind. I came on a Tuesday morning, expecting fence posts or a new door threshold or some other straightforward repair work. What she showed me instead was a drawing on the back of a flour sack. She had done it in carpenter's pencil, which told me something about her. Most women in the township, if they drew anything at all, used whatever came to hand. Carpenter's pencil meant she had thought about precision before she started. The drawing showed her cabin from above, a rectangle at the center. Around it, at a measured distance of 10 inches, she had drawn a 2nd rectangle. Between the 2 rectangles, she had drawn small arrows, and the arrows were doing 2 different things. Along the outer rectangle, they moved. Along the inner rectangle, they were still. She tapped the gap between the 2 walls with her finger. "Dead air," she said. "Moving air steals heat through convection. Still air resists it. The outer wall takes the weather. The inner wall lives in calm." I looked at the drawing for a while. I was not certain what she was describing. I had built walls for 30 years, and I had never built them in pairs with a deliberate gap between them, and I told her so. She said that was fine. She needed someone who could build to precise measurements, and she would explain the purpose as the work required. She asked if I understood the drawing well enough to begin. I said I thought I did. She said, "Good. There are 3 things I need from this structure. The first is that the outer wall must be independent of the inner wall. No direct contact between the 2 skins except at the anchored frame. The second is a drainage gap at the base, screened to hold fill material. The third is ventilation at the eaves, 1/2 inch, continuous." I wrote those 3 things in my own notebook. Then I asked her where she had learned to specify a wall this way. She said, "My father made barrels in Lancaster County. My neighbor, I'll introduce you to her, makes teepees. And a magazine I've had since 1882 said the same thing in a third language. I did not fully understand what she meant, but I picked up my tools and I began. Word spread the way it always did in a township where the distances between farms meant that any unusual activity became a topic of extended discussion on the road into town. By the end of the second week of July, every man within 4 miles had an opinion about what the widow Voss was building around her cabin. The phrase that caught on, I can tell you who said it first, and I won't, because he spent January burning his books to stay warm, and I think that's consequence enough. The phrase was a fence around a house. It had the particular quality of a mocking phrase that also happened to be literally accurate, which gave it staying power. The outer frame did look, from a distance, like a fence set oddly close to the structure it surrounded. Men on the road slowed their wagons to look. Some stopped entirely. The storekeeper came by one afternoon in mid-July and stood watching for a while with his thumbs in his vest pockets. He said that he hoped she understood what she was spending in lumber, because the mill wasn't offering credit to unattached claims this season, and he'd hate to see her overextend on something that a tighter chinking job wouldn't solve for a quarter the price. Marta was measuring the spacing on a ledger block when he said this. She finished the measurement before she answered. Then she said that the chinking was fine, and the problem wasn't the chinking. The storekeeper waited for more. She didn't offer it. He left. Reverend Peck made 2 more visits through the summer, each one slightly more pointed than the last. He had developed a theory, shared with select members of the congregation, that Marta Voss was not fully herself yet after Heinrich's death, that grief sometimes expressed itself in unusual projects, in the need to do something physical and consuming as a way of avoiding the interior work of mourning. He was not wrong that she was grieving. He was entirely wrong about what she was doing. The only person who came by without an opinion was Agnes Lindqvist, the storekeeper's wife, who arrived one afternoon in late July with a loaf of bread and 2 genuine questions. She stood at the edge of the work and looked at the frame and the gap and the drawings that Marta kept tacked to the inner wall of the cabin, and she said, "What goes between the walls?" And then, "How do you know it will hold the warmth?" Marta looked at her for a moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding something. Then she set down her tools and answered both questions fully. I was working nearby, and I heard the whole conversation. I kept working. I wished now that I had set down my tools, too, and listened more carefully. But I was a hired carpenter, and there was frame to finish, and I thought I understood what was being built. I did not understand what was being built. Before I describe what we built, I should describe what she knew and how she came to know it. Because the construction itself, the pickets, the ledger blocks, the fill and the venting and the drainage gap, none of that makes full sense unless you understand that Marta Voss was not inventing something new. She was recognizing something old. There is a difference, and it matters to the story. She told me about it in pieces over the 3 weeks I worked for her. Not as a lecture and not as a confession, more the way a careful person shares information when they've decided the other person has earned it. A detail here, a detail there, offered between measurements or at the end of a working day when we sat on the south side of the cabin where the evening light was still good. By the time I left in late June with my final quart of milk and my tools loaded back into the wagon, I had most of it. The rest I learned later from Agnes, who had it more completely because she asked better questions than I did. The story begins not in Minnesota, and not in 1888, but in a barrel workshop in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, sometime in the late 1850s, when Marta Voss was still Marta Schaefer and still a girl. Her father was a cooper, a maker of barrels and casks, and the various wooden vessels that the agricultural world of that era required in large numbers. Fermentation barrels for cider and vinegar, storage casks for salted pork, shipping containers for flour and dried goods. It was skilled work, and her father was good at it, and he was the kind of craftsman who explained what he was doing while he did it, not because he expected his daughter to become a cooper herself, but because he believed that understanding the reason behind a technique was more valuable than memorizing the technique alone. One of the things he explained more than once was why the fermentation barrels had to breathe. A barrel stave, he told her, is not meant to be a perfect seal. It is meant to be a controlled one. The wood must be able to respond to moisture and temperature, to expand slightly in humid conditions, to contract in dry ones. And if you pack the staves too tightly against each other, if you eliminate every trace of air from between them, the wood cannot move and the barrel fails. The gap is not a flaw. The gap is the mechanism. He showed her how different materials held temperature differently, how the thick oak of a wine barrel would stay cool in the summer cellar while thin pine would warm through in an afternoon. He showed her how packing material placed between stacked barrels, straw, sawdust, layers of burlap, kept the contents stable, not because the material itself was cold or warm, but because it held the air around the barrels still. Moving air, he said, is the enemy of stable temperature. It carries warmth away in winter and carries heat in during summer. Still, air simply holds what is already there. Marta was perhaps 9 years old when she learned this. She did not think of it again, particularly, for 30 years. It was simply part of what she knew about the physical world, the way a person absorbs the principles of their childhood without cataloging them as knowledge. The second piece came in the spring of 1888, in the weeks between Heinrich's burial and my arrival at the farm. There was a trading post 4 miles south of the township's center, a low building that smelled of tobacco and oiled leather and the particular combination of goods that served as currency in a region where actual currency was sometimes scarce. Marta went there to sell butter and buy salt, which was the routine of most farms in the area, and she went more frequently in those weeks than she might have otherwise. I think the walk did her good. I think being in motion helped, in the way that physical work sometimes helps when the interior work is too large to approach directly. The woman she met there on the 3rd or 4th visit was named Wapaha Ska. In the Dakota language, the name means white hat, though she was not wearing a hat of any particular color when Marta described her to me later. She was perhaps 60 years old, Marta thought, with the careful, unhurried manner of a person conducting business in a place that was not designed for her comfort, but that she had learned to navigate on her own terms. She came to the trading post to sell beadwork, embroidered pieces of considerable skill, the kind that required weeks of close work and commanded fair prices from buyers who knew what they were looking at. Marta was not buying beadwork that day. She was waiting for the storekeeper to finish weighing her butter when she noticed in the carry bag beside Wapaha Ska's display cloth a folded piece of fabric she had not seen before. It was thick and plain, a deep brown, entirely unlike the intricate embroidered pieces laid out for sale. She asked about it. Wapaha Ska looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that takes the measure of a question before deciding whether to answer it, and then she lifted the fabric out of the bag and unfolded part of it on the counter. It was a section of teepee liner. She explained it the way a craftsperson explains their work to someone who has asked a serious question, with precision and without embellishment. The liner was a separate inner wall, she said, hung inside the teepee from a height of roughly 4 feet, leaving a gap of several inches between the liner and the outer hide. The outer hide caught the wind. The liner created a still zone on the interior side of that gap. Between the two skins, the air did not move. Marta asked how wide the gap needed to be. Wapaha Ska said it varied. Wider was generally better. The principle was the same at any width. What mattered was that the gap existed and that the air within it was not being circulated by the pressure of the wind outside. Marta asked what happened in a very hard wind. The outer skin flexes, Wapaha Ska said. It absorbs the wind's force. The liner does not move. The people inside live in still air. Marta stood with this information for a moment. The storekeeper finished with the butter. Outside, a wagon went past on the road. Then Marta said, "And the cold, does the still air hold warmth?" Wapahaska said that was the purpose. That evening, Marta went to the wooden crate beside the bed where she kept the papers she considered worth keeping. Heinrich's documents, the land survey, 2 letters from her brother, and a copy of Scientific American from October 1881 that she had found at a church sale in Pennsylvania the year before she and Heinrich came west. She had bought it for 3 cents because an article in it had caught her eye, and she had not had time to finish reading it before they called the sale to a close. The article was about ice storage. Commercial ice, the business of cutting winter ice from northern lakes and rivers and storing it through the summer for sale in cities, was a significant industry in those years, and the article described the engineering principles that made large-scale cold storage possible. The central principle was insulation through dead air. Inner and outer walls separated by a cavity packed with sawdust or tan bark, fibrous material that trapped air in countless small pockets and prevented the circulation that would otherwise carry the cold away. The article used a phrase that Marta had underlined in pencil in 1881 and still remembered in 1888. Motionless air is the perfect insulator. The author was describing the preservation of cold in summer, but the physics, Marta understood, ran in both directions. If still air prevented cold from escaping a summer ice house, the same still air would prevent warmth from escaping a winter cabin. She sat with the magazine in her lap and thought about her father's barrels and the gap between the staves. She thought about the teepee liner and the still zone between 2 skins. She thought about the arrows she would later draw on the flour sack, moving at the outer wall, motionless at the inner. 3 people in 3 different contexts had observed the same physical truth. Her father had learned it from wood and fermentation. Wapahaska's people had learned it from hide and wind. The ice merchants had learned it from sawdust and summer heat. None of them had invented it. It was simply true, and they had each, in their own working lives, noticed that it was true and built accordingly. Marta Voss noticed that they were all describing the same thing. That, I have come to think, was the actual act of intelligence in this story. Not the building. I built part of it myself, and I am a competent carpenter, but not a remarkable one. The act of intelligence was the recognition that a barrel workshop in Pennsylvania and a Dakota teepee and a commercial ice house were all solving the same problem with the same solution, and that a cabin on 40 acres in Crow Wing County in the winter of 1888 was the same problem again. The design, when she showed it to me, was simpler than I expected and more deliberate than it looked. The outer wall would stand 10 inches clear of the existing log cabin, far enough to create a meaningful airspace, close enough to be practical with available lumber. The frame would be built from cedar pickets set at 36-inch intervals, connected by horizontal ledger blocks every 48 inches to keep the outer skin true and prevent racking under wind load. The outer skin itself would be vertical boards, 1x10 rough-sawn pine from the county mill, run floor to eave and battened at every seam with 1x3 strips to seal the joints against driven weather. At the base of the outer wall, a 5/8-inch drainage gap, screened with woven wire to hold fill material in place, but open enough to let moisture pass through rather than accumulate. At the eaves, a continuous 1/2-inch vent slot to allow the cavity to breathe, preventing the moisture buildup that would rot the fill from within. The fill itself would be a mixture of what was available and dry: sawdust from the Jamestown mill, which the millwright gave away to anyone who hauled it themselves, and dried pine needles from the tree line on the northern edge of the property, and creek moss gathered from the eastern bank and spread on drying racks she built from fence scrap. All of it cut small and loose, tamped to a density that held its position without compressing the air pockets between fibers. She had calculated from the dimensions of the cabin approximately 90 cubic feet of cavity to fill. She wanted all of it dry as paper before the first frost. I asked her, on that first morning, what she expected the wall to accomplish. She picked up the flour sack drawing and pointed to the arrows. "The outer wall will take the wind's full force," she said. "Wind under pressure infiltrates any single barrier. It finds the gaps. It drives cold through the logs. It turns the cabin into a bellows that pumps heat out as fast as the stove produces it. But if the wind expends its force on the outer skin, what reaches the inner logs is not moving air. It is still air. And still air holds whatever temperature the cabin has managed to build." She set the drawing down. "I need 30% less heat loss. That is the number. If the wall delivers 30%, my firewood is sufficient. If it delivers more, I have a margin." I did not ask her what happened if it delivered less. I don't think she had entertained that possibility, or if she had decided it was not a useful thing to think about. We began on a Thursday in the second week of June, in weather that was warm and clear, and gave no indication of what it was quietly preparing for the months ahead. I set the first picket on the south face, plumbed it with a level I had brought from my own shop, and marked the ground for the second. Marta worked alongside me on the north face, setting her own pickets by eye and checking them against a plumb bob she had made from a bolt tied to a length of string. Her lines were as true as mine. I noticed this and said nothing about it, because there was nothing useful to say. It was simply accurate. The work had a rhythm that good construction usually finds after the first hour. Measure, mark, set, check, move to the next. The morning was quiet except for the sound of our tools, and occasionally the distant complaint of crows in the tree line to the north. The cabin sat between us as we worked around it, patient and ordinary-looking, giving no outward sign of what it was about to become. By noon we had the south and east faces framed. Marta brought out bread and hard cheese, and we ate on the south side where the shadow of the cabin was beginning to lengthen, and she showed me the next phase of the drawing, the ledger block placement, the sequence for the outer skin, the precise location of the drainage gap at the base. I studied the drawing, and I saw for the first time that it was not a rough sketch. It had dimensions noted in a careful hand, with tolerances marked and material specified, and a small notation at the corner that read, "Check vent clearance before fill." This was not improvisation. This had been worked out over weeks. I asked her how long she had been planning it. She considered the question. "Since April," she said. "Since the ledger." I thought about Heinrich then, about a man I had known slightly, a quiet, capable blacksmith who had built a sound cabin and broken good ground, and died in the spring before he could see what his wife did with the summer. I thought about the ledger open on the table in the candlelight, the columns of figures, the woman sitting alone counting her way toward a decision. I did not say any of this. I finished the bread and picked up my tools. There was frame to build, and the season was not waiting. There is a particular quality to construction work in summer that I have always found steadying. The days are long, the light is generous, the materials behave predictably in the warmth, and the body, working outdoors in good weather, finds a pace that it can sustain for hours without complaint. I have done my best thinking while doing straightforward physical work in summer, and I believe most carpenters would say the same. The hands are occupied and the mind is free, and if the work is honest work, level lines, true corners, joints that close cleanly, there is a satisfaction in it that does not require anyone else's acknowledgement to feel complete. Working on Marta Voss's outer wall that June and into July had most of those qualities. The cedar pickets went in straight. The ledger blocks sat level. The outer skin of rough pine went up in vertical courses with a consistency that pleased me professionally, each board butted tight at the top and bottom, each batten strip closing the seam against weather as it should. From a technical standpoint, it was not complicated work. It was careful work, which is a different thing. Complicated work taxes the mind. Careful work taxes the attention. I have always found careful work more tiring at the end of a day and more satisfying. What made this particular careful work unusual was that almost everyone who stopped to observe it believed it was foolish. The storekeeper had been the first to say his piece in July, but he was not the last, and as the summer progressed, the commentary acquired a kind of communal texture. Variations on the same essential theme passed between neighbors at the feed store and along the road and at the twice-monthly church service, until the phrase "fence around a house" had become so established in the local vocabulary that people used it without remembering anymore that it had started as a joke. A farmer named Wickland, who had the place 2 miles to the northwest, stopped his wagon on a Tuesday in mid-July and watched us work for a full 10 minutes before offering his assessment. He said that a double wall might make sense in a commercial building. He'd seen something similar at an ice house in St. Paul, but that for a residence, a man was better served by tight chinking and a good hardwood fire. Pine burned too fast and too cool, he said, looking at the pine boards going up on the outer skin. You wanted oak or ash if you meant to hold heat. I thanked him for the observation. He waited to see if Marta would respond. She was fitting a ledger block on the north face and did not look up. After a while he clicked his tongue at his horse and moved on. Reverend Peck came by twice more that summer, each visit more carefully phrased than the last. He had developed, I think, a genuine theological position on the matter. Not that the wall was wrong exactly, but that the isolation of the project concerned him. A woman alone, turning her grief into lumber and labor, building something that no one around her understood or endorsed, working through the hottest weeks of summer on a project that might fail. This was not, in Peck's view, the posture of a person who had properly surrendered her burden to the Lord and to community. He said something close to this on his second visit, gently and with evident care, and Marta listened to all of it and said that she appreciated his concern and that the work was going well. Peck looked at the half-finished outer skin and the tools laid out in their precise arrangement, and the flour sack drawing tack to the cabin door where Marta could consult it without going inside. And I could see him searching for something to say that might penetrate the particular calm she carried. He did not find it. He said he would pray for her. She thanked him. He rode away looking like a man who had tried to open a window and found it painted shut from the inside. I did not find this funny exactly, but I found it clarifying. There are people in this world who believe that certainty is a form of hardness, that a person who does not visibly waver is a person who has closed herself off from wisdom. Peck was that kind of man. What he could not see was that Marta's certainty was not hardness. It was conclusion. She had done the arithmetic. She had read the article. She had stood at the trading post and heard Wapahaska describe the still air between two skins and felt the thing click into place that had been quietly assembling in her mind since her father's workshop. She was not refusing to doubt. She had already doubted, carefully, and come out the other side. There is a difference between a person who will not think and a person who has finished thinking. Most people, in my experience, cannot tell them apart. Agnes Lindquist came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of July, when the outer skin was 3/4 complete, and I was cutting batten strips on a sawhorse near the east face. She came on foot, which meant she had walked the 1.25 miles from her husband's store, which meant the visit was intentional rather than incidental. She carried a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread, and she set it on the sawhorse without ceremony and stood looking at the wall with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. I had seen a dozen people look at that wall over the preceding weeks. Agnes looked at it differently. The others were looking for confirmation of what they already believed, that it was excessive, peculiar, a monument to a widow's untethered judgment. Agnes was looking at it as a problem to be read. She was looking at the gap and the screened base and the vent slot beginning to take shape at the eave line, and she was working something out. She asked 2 questions. The first was, what goes between the walls? Marta, who had come around from the north face when she heard the wagon, though Agnes had come on foot, not by wagon, and I think Marta simply heard the change in the quality of silence That means another person has arrived. Marta considered Agnes for a moment and then said, sawdust from the mill, dried pine needles, creek moss, all of it cut loose and dry. She said, the material is not the point. The material is only the structure that holds the air in place. Agnes's second question was, how do you know it will hold the warmth? And here something shifted in Marta. Not dramatically, nothing about her was dramatic. But she set down the tool she was holding, and she turned to face Agnes fully in a way she had not turned to face Wickland or Peck or any of the others who had stopped on the road. She said, because the same principle is working in every ice house built in the last 30 years, and in every teepee on the northern plains, and in my father's barrel shop in Lancaster County. Moving air takes temperature away in whatever direction the temperature wants to go. Still air holds it. The outer wall breaks the wind. The cavity holds air that cannot circulate. The inner logs live in stillness. She paused. Then she said, come inside and I will show you the article. They were inside for the better part of an hour. I ate some of the bread and kept cutting batten strips. And when they came back out, Agnes had the expression of a person who has been given the answer to a question they have been carrying for a long time without knowing they were carrying it. She stood looking at the wall again, but differently this time. She was no longer reading it as a puzzle. She was reading it as a solution. She asked if she could come back. Marta said yes. Agnes came back 4 more times before the first frost. The setback came in the second week of August, as setbacks in construction often do. Not dramatically, not with warning, but as the simple consequence of weather behaving like weather. We had finished the outer skin by then and begun preparing the fill material. Marta had built drying racks from fence scrap along the south side of the cabin, simple frames strung with salvaged wire, angled to catch the afternoon sun, and she had been filling them methodically for 2 weeks with dried pine needles gathered from the tree line and creek moss spread thin to cure. I had helped her haul 3 loads of sawdust from the county mill in my wagon, bagged in burlap sacks she had sewn herself from empty feed material. The sawdust was already dry when it left the mill and required no curing. The pine needles and moss were coming along. Then a 3-day rain arrived from the northwest, the kind of August rain that comes warm and steady and without particular malice and ruins things in a quiet, thorough way. By the end of the second day, the drying racks were soaked through. The pine needles, which had been within a week of being ready, would need to be spread and dried again from the beginning. The moss was worse. It had absorbed moisture at a rate that would require a full week of good sun to reverse, and August was not reliably generous with full weeks of good sun. I was not there when Marta discovered the damage. I came by the following morning and found her spreading the pine needles over the racks again, layer by single layer, working with the unhurried attention she brought to every physical task. The ruined moss was heaped to one side. She had already gathered fresh moss from the creek bank before I arrived and spread it in a separate row. I said, I'm sorry about the rain. She said I had allowed for delays. I asked if she was certain she had enough time before first frost. She said she had calculated for 6 weeks of curing, and there were 7 weeks remaining before the first frost date she was planning against. She said this without emphasis, the way a person states a measurement they have taken twice and trust. I did not ask what she was planning against for the second frost date, or the third. I understood by then that Marta Voss had considered all of these questions before I arrived and would continue considering them after I left, and that my job was to build to her specifications and let her worry about the margins. The outer wall was complete by the end of August. I spent my final 2 days fitting the hinged shutter panels over the window openings, outer panels that could swing closed against weather and seal with a wooden latch or open to allow normal use. Marta had designed these herself, and they were more elegant than I expected. The hinge placement allowed the panels to sit flush with the outer skin when open, so they did not catch wind or create unnecessary turbulence at the wall surface. I built them to her specification, and I thought, not for the first time, that she had a carpenter's mind in the sense that matters most, the ability to hold 3 dimensions in the imagination and see the problems before they are built. My last morning there, I walked the full perimeter of the completed outer wall before I loaded my tools. The work was sound, the corners were plumb, the battens closed every seam. The drainage gap at the base ran continuous and clean, screened evenly with the woven wire Marta had cut herself. At the eave line, the vent slots were consistent and clear. From the road, it looked exactly like what Wickland and Peck and the storekeeper said it looked like, a fence around a house. From close up, with a carpenter's eye, it looked like what it was, a second building, precisely constructed to serve one purpose, which was to stand between the first building and the weather and give the first building a chance to hold what it had. I said it looked right to me. Marta said she thought so too. She thanked me for the work and shook my hand, which was not the custom between a hired carpenter and the woman who had employed him, but she did it simply, and I shook it simply back. I drove home with my empty milk jars and my tools and thought about the winter coming. September arrived and then moved through itself quickly, the way September does in Minnesota when the land is preparing for something and the light is changing its angle and everything that was green begins to show its underlying color. Marta filled the cavity. She worked alone through most of it, tamping the loose mixture of sawdust and pine needles and cured moss into the 10-inch space with a flat wooden paddle she had shaped herself from a fence board. The work required more care than it appeared to. The fill needed to be dense enough to stay in position, but light enough to maintain the air pockets between fibers, and the difference between too dense and right was a matter of feel that she had calibrated, she told Agnes later, by pressing her palm flat against the tamped fill and pushing slowly. If it gave a 1/4 inch, it was right. If it held rigid, she had packed it too hard and had to work sections loose and retamp. At the top of each wall section, before she closed the cavity, she stapled a layer of muslin salvaged from worn flour sacks, a wind check to prevent the fill from settling downward over time and creating cold gaps at the upper sections of the wall, where warm interior air collected and where any gap in the insulation would be most costly. She had read about this technique in the Ice House article, which used canvas rather than muslin for the same purpose in commercial storage buildings. By the 1st of October, the fill was in. The outer wall was sealed. Then, in the second week of October, she did one more thing, something I did not see and learned about from Thorvaldson's notes the following spring. She built a vestibule. 2 plank screens set at angles around the outer door, forming a small enclosed entry between the outer door and the inner cabin door. The screens were not elaborate, rough boards, fitted joints, sealed with the same batten strips as the outer wall, but their function was specific and, as Thorvaldson later documented, measurable. A person entering the cabin passed through 2 doors instead of 1, and between those 2 doors was a small column of air that buffered the exchange between outside and inside. Every time the outer door opened and closed, that buffer absorbed the infiltration before it reached the living space. Every time the inner door opened, it opened into air that had already been partially tempered. She demonstrated this to Thorvaldson in January using a candle held at the inner door threshold. Before the vestibule, the flame had bent sharply toward the interior whenever the outer door was opened, indicating a direct pressure exchange. With the vestibule in place, the flame barely moved. I did not build the vestibule. She built it herself in 2 days, and Elias said afterward the joinery was as clean as anything he had done professionally. He felt some professional pride in this, the way a teacher feels pride in a student who has exceeded them, though he had not taught her anything and she was not his student. He simply recognized the quality of the work. The first frost came on the 14th of October, light and thin, more a suggestion than a statement. The prairie grass went silver at the edges. The creek slowed. The particular quality of the air changed in the way that anyone who has spent a winter in Minnesota knows. A new weight in it, a clarity that is the cold's calling card before the cold itself arrives. Marta's woodpile stood on the north side of the cabin, stacked and covered with oiled canvas. It was smaller than every other woodpile in the township. Agnes had seen it in September and said nothing, because Agnes was the kind of woman who understood that saying nothing was sometimes the most respectful response to another person's considered decision. The storekeeper's wife on the eastern road had seen it and told her husband, who mentioned it to Reverend Peck, who stopped by one final time in mid-October with the careful face of a man delivering difficult news gently. He stood beside the woodpile and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, in the tone of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, he had arranged for 2 additional cords to be delivered from the Vickland farm at no cost to her, as a gift from the congregation, no obligation, simply a practical provision to see a neighbor through a hard season. Marta looked at the woodpile. She looked at Peck. She said, "That is very kind." She said, "I have what I need." Peck said the forecasts he had heard from the men who watched the weather in this county for many years were not encouraging. It was shaping up, they said, to be a cold one. Marta said, "I expect so." Peck rode away, and I imagine he went home and wrote the word concerned in his pastoral notes for the 2nd or 3rd time that year, and I imagine he prayed for her in the specific way that people pray for someone they believe has made a serious mistake. He was not wrong that the winter would be cold. He had no idea how cold. The cold arrived without the courtesy of a storm. A blizzard at least announces itself. It has drama and momentum and a kind of violent honesty. You can see it coming across the open country, a gray wall moving with purpose, and the seeing of it gives you time to bank your fire and bring in your animals and settle into the posture of a person waiting out something large. The township knew blizzards. They had procedures for blizzards. What came in the 2nd week of January 1889 was different. It came quietly, the way debt comes. Not all at once, but as a steady accumulation, each day fractionally colder than the last, until one morning you looked at the thermometer nailed to the porch post, and the mercury had dropped below the place where you had ever seen it rest before and showed no interest in rising. -34 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 9th. -38 by the 11th. A north wind not strong enough to be dramatic, but persistent enough to be relentless, finding every gap in every wall in the township and pressing through with the patience of something that had all winter and no other business. It stayed for 12 days. I was stranded 2 miles east at the Halverson place, where I had gone to repair a door frame that had swelled and split in the early December wet. The cold locked me there on the 9th morning as certainly as a key turns in a lock. The temperature made travel genuinely dangerous for man and horse alike, and Halverson and his wife, sensible people, would not hear of me attempting the road home. I spent 12 days watching their single-wall cabin lose its argument with the weather. Halverson was a capable builder. His chinking was tight. His door seals were better than average. He had 4½ cords of good mixed hardwood stacked under cover on the south wall, which should have been sufficient for a normal January. By the 5th day of the freeze, he was burning through his daily allocation before midnight and waking to interior temperatures that left ice on the water surface in the kitchen pail. His wife hung blankets over the interior walls as a secondary barrier. They helped somewhat. Not enough. By the 8th day, I had begun, involuntarily, to think about Marta Voss's woodpile, the small one covered in oiled canvas on the north side of the cabin. I thought about the fill going into that cavity in September, the sawdust and pine needles and creek moss tamped to exactly the right density with a wooden paddle she had shaped herself. I thought about the vent slots and the drainage gap and the vestibule she had built alone in 2 October days. I thought, either she is the warmest person in this county tonight, or she is dead. I did not know which, and I could not go and find out, and the not knowing sat in me for 12 days like a cold of its own. 3 miles to the west, Reverend Peck was burning his books. He told me this himself later with the directness of a man who had decided that honesty about the fact was the minimum he owed the situation. He had gone through his practical volumes first, the almanacs, the agricultural guides, a set of legal references he had never much consulted. Then, a commentary on the book of Romans that he had read twice and marked extensively. He said he felt the loss of that one specifically, and then he said, with the kind of precision that comes from having had a long time to think about something, what I felt the loss of was the margin notes. The book itself I had memorized well enough. The conversation I had been having with it over 20 years, that was what burned. The Johansen cabin, a mile south of Peck, was a different order of crisis. Henrik and Britta had sufficient firewood. What they did not have was a wall system capable of maintaining consistent interior temperature, and their daughter, 4 months old in January, born in September into what should have been the easier part of the season, could not regulate her small body against the swings. 12 degrees at 3 in the morning, 38 by noon, 12 again the following night. Dr. Thorvaldsen came on the 4th day and spent a long time listening to the infant's breathing and wrote in his case notes, not the cold itself, the inconsistency. A small body regulating against a moving target exhausts faster than one holding steady against uniform cold. He left medicine he did not fully believe would address the actual problem, because the actual problem was the walls, and he had no prescription for walls. Then he went to Marta Voss's cabin. He told me about it the following spring, sitting in my shop with his hands around a coffee cup, still slightly puzzled by it in the way that honest scientists remain puzzled by things that work better than they expected. He said he had gone expecting to find her in distress or worse, that he had framed the visit in his mind as a welfare check, the kind he made for elderly members of the congregation during hard cold. He knocked. She opened the door. She was wearing a work shirt and no additional layer. He stepped inside. His breath did not cloud. He stood in the doorway for a moment, he said, just standing there, because the body registers warmth before the mind catches up, and his body was registering something it had not felt in 5 days of riding between freezing cabins. He looked at the water pail, surface unbroken. He looked at the interior log walls. No frost, no crystalline coating, no dark patches of absorbed cold. He asked if he could come in and ask questions. She said yes, and put the kettle on, and took Heinrich's ledger from the shelf. The numbers were there in her hand, recorded each morning at 6 o'clock. Outer wall surface temperature, inner log surface temperature, the differential between them. The differential ran between 18 and 22 degrees Fahrenheit across the 12 days of the freeze. Her firewood consumption through the period was 58% of what Thorvaldsen estimated a comparable single-wall cabin would require to achieve the same interior target. He copied the numbers into his own notebook. Then he asked for her pipe, and she handed it to him without asking why, and he lit it and held the stem near the outer wall and watched the smoke move, sharply, immediately, bent by wind pressure infiltrating through the plank seams. He moved to the interior log surface and held the feather she offered him near the chinking. It did not stir. He sat at her table for 2 hours. He asked about the fill density and the vent clearance and the vestibule and the drainage gap, and she answered each question with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete without elaboration, waiting for the next question rather than filling silence with additional words. Before he left, he asked her one question that was not technical. He asked, "Did you know it would work this well?" She considered the question for a moment. Then she said, "I knew the principle was sound. The principle had been working in other applications for decades. I calculated 30% heat retention improvement. The wall has delivered more than that." She paused. I believe she allowed herself, in that pause, something close to satisfaction. Not pride in the sense of requiring witness, but the quieter satisfaction of a thing performing as the reasoning said it should. Then she said, "I am glad about the margin." Agnes Lindqvist came on the 9th day, after dark, carrying her son wrapped in wool against her chest. She did not explain at length. She had been lying awake for 3 nights, listening to the boys' breathing tighten in the cold, and she had made the decision that her husband did not fully endorse, and she had walked the 1.25 miles in 30 below air because walking was faster than harnessing a horse she was not certain she could harness alone in that cold. Marta opened the door and moved her chair. By the following morning, the boy's breathing had steadied. He slept for 6 hours without waking. Agnes sat at the table and cried for a short while, not dramatically, just the specific release of a person who has been frightened for days and is now in a warm room with her child asleep. Then she stopped and asked Marta every question she had been holding since July. The Johansson family arrived that evening, and then a neighbor couple from the North Road, and eventually 8 people occupied the cabin that Marta had built for one. The vestibule baffles held. The fill held. The differential held. But the detail I find most worth recording, the detail Thorvaldsen underlined twice in his notes, is this. The collective firewood consumption for 8 people in that cabin across the final 3 days of the freeze was 30% less per person than what each family had been burning alone in their failing single-wall homes. The principle worked for 8 as well as it worked for 1. The wall did not care how many people it was protecting. In the spring, people asked, not ceremoniously, not with speeches. Agnes asked first, in March, with her notebook open. Dimensions, fill material, spacing intervals, the muslin wind check, the drainage gap measurement. She was writing to women in the next county, and she wanted the specifications exact. Thorvaldsen asked for his county report, which he filed in May, and which was acknowledged and archived without much practical consequence. Agnes's letters reached 3 homesteads by August. 2 of them had begun building by September. The record does not reflect this. The record rarely reflects how things actually move. Reverend Peck made his request last. He said he had been thinking all winter about the schoolhouse, that the children's comfort was a pastoral concern as much as a practical one, that he believed the community ought to consider this method for the building where the county's youngest members spent their days. He said he had been turning it over. I was present for this conversation. I did not look at Marta while Peck was speaking, because I did not want to see her expression and be unable to keep my own expression appropriate. I looked at the middle distance, and when Peck finished, I looked at my hands, and Marta said, "That seems like a good idea," and she gave him the specifications he needed. One more thing, and then I am finished. In May, at the first trading day of the spring season, Marta went to the trading post. She came back with a piece of beadwork, a large panel, the most expensive thing Wapahaska had on the table, the kind of piece that represents weeks of close work and commands a price that is not haggled over by anyone who understands what they are looking at. She told me about it years later. She said she set the money on the counter without explanation. She said Wapahaska looked at the money and then looked at her and nodded once. That was all. I was not there. I have only Marta's account of it, and Marta was not given to embellishment. But I have thought about that moment many times in the years since. 2 women at a trading post counter, 1 nod between them, no language sufficient for what was being acknowledged, and none attempted. The official record of what happened in Crow Wing County in the winter of 1888 and the spring of 1889 mentions a double-wall construction technique documented by a county physician and attributed to a homesteader named Voss. That is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. The young man from the newspaper had stopped writing some time ago. He was sitting with his pencil resting on his knee and his notebook on the step beside him, looking at the lot where the Voss property had stood before the feed warehouse came. I picked up my hammer. The church step needed its last 2 nails. I said she never left that land. Built a proper barn the following summer, double-walled, but that's a different story. I drove past the place last spring, 50 years after the winter I have been describing to you. The outer planks have been replaced twice. The inner logs are the ones Heinrich laid in 1882. The principle held. She wasn't the kind of person who set out to prove things to other people. She was the kind of person who figured out what was true and then acted on it. There is a difference between those two things. Not everyone can see it, but there is a difference. I set the last nail and drove it clean, and we sat for a while without talking, and the afternoon light came across the county road at the low angle that means the day is nearly finished. And somewhere in the tree line to the north, a crow called once, and then was quiet.